Have you ever seen a person living under the same roof as power, and still staying as invisible as smoke? Tessa Hart, 28, looks swallowed up inside the Knox mansion in Chicago, with its stone columns cold to the touch, its crystal chandeliers shining like a fairy tale, yet the air inside is so quiet it turns eerie. No laughter, no warmth, only the heating system murmuring as if it's reminding her this isn't a home at all, it's a fortress. For 14 straight hours, Tessa scrubs floors, scours the kitchen, washes glasses, and serves private meetings steeped in the smell of liquor and cigarette smoke, keeping her head down for people so rich they've forgotten other human beings are human too, until night comes and, in that empty living room, 2 tiny lives curl up beneath a thin blanket. The twin boys, Eli and Owen, only 3 months old, their mother gone, and almost fatherless as well, because the man who carries the Knox name is always disappearing behind closed doors. Tonight, one baby burns with fever, the other cries until his throat turns raw, and Tessa gathers them both into her arms, pacing through the dark until her knees tremble like they're about to give out, her hands aching and stinging, still keeping time with each small breath, still patting and soothing, again and again. When the last of the crying finally fades, she spreads the blanket on the floor beside the fireplace, the only place in a house colder than the winter outside that still feels warm, and she folds herself down next to the 2 babies, whispering like a prayer, "Just close my eyes for 1 second." And in that exact moment, click, the front door swings open, cold air surges in like a blade, heavy footsteps strike the marble floor, and a man's voice, cold as steel, cuts the darkness in two. What the hell is going on here? If you found this excerpt gripping, please like to support me. Share it with someone who also enjoys stories that are dramatic, yet warm at the core. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The office door slammed shut behind them, the sound of oak striking a steel frame cracking through the silent mansion like a gunshot with no muzzle flash. Adrian didn't turn on the overhead light. Only the desk lamp cast a murky gold across a walnut tabletop buried under paperwork, maps, and 2 phones turned face down. He shoved Tessa toward the chair opposite, but he didn't invite her to sit. He didn't sit either. He stayed standing, both hands braced on the desk, staring straight at her as if he were reading every millimeter of her face for a fracture, for a lie hiding underneath. "Who gave you the right to touch my children?" Adrian didn't shout. He didn't roar. It was simply a question pressed so flat it sounded more frightening than any scream. Tessa swallowed. Her back stayed straight, but her knees trembled, not because she was afraid of Adrian, but because she knew that if she chose the wrong word, she'd be thrown out of this mansion before dawn, and those 2 babies would cry again in a room where no one heard them. Eli had a fever of 38.5 degrees at 2 o'clock in the morning, Tessa said, her voice quiet but steady. Owen cried himself hoarse until his face turned purple. I checked him. His mouth was dry, and his bottle was stone cold. No one even knew how long it had been that way. The night shift didn't go into the nursery for 4 hours. I didn't touch your children because I wanted to. I touched them because there was no one else left to touch them. Adrian didn't answer right away. His finger tapped the desk, slow and measured. 1, 2, 3 beats, as steady as a countdown clock. He walked around to the front of the desk. Now the space between them was less than a single step, and his gaze dropped to Tessa's wrist. The bruise. It sat just under her cuff, purple-black spreading like ink on wet paper, the shape unmistakably 4 fingers clamped tight. Adrian didn't ask, "Are you okay?" because he wasn't the kind of man who asked that. He asked the question a man with power over life and death would ask. "Who did it?" Tessa tugged her sleeve down. "I bumped into a door." "You're lying to me in my own office." Adrian tilted his head. His voice sank another half-tone, and when Adrian Knox's voice dropped, everything around it seemed to hold its breath. "I'll ask again, and I suggest you understand I'm not asking a 3rd time. Who did it?" Tessa met his eyes. In them she saw not only anger, but something deeper, something that looked like shame, as if he'd just realized that under a roof where he controlled every brick, someone had dared to raise a hand to a woman and he hadn't even known. But Tessa didn't speak, not because she was protecting the one who'd done it, but because she knew that if she said Holt's name right now, with Adrian in this state, blood would spill before she could explain anything, and she didn't want another life on her conscience over a bruise. "I'll tell you," Tessa answered slowly, "when you're calmer." The office fell into a heavy silence. Adrian stared at her for 3 long seconds that felt like 3 centuries, then turned away, walked back to the desk, opened the bottom right drawer, and took out a different phone, not one of the 2 on the desk. This one was smaller, older, unbranded, a private line. He pressed a single number and waited through exactly 2 rings. Grant. 1 word, and whoever was on the other end clearly understood this wasn't a midnight call to ask about someone's health. Lock down the entire house security. No one goes out, no one comes in. Change the code to the nursery door. Only I and Miss Hart have access. Review last night's shift roster. I want to know who abandoned their post and why. Put the list on my desk before 6 o'clock in the morning. He ended the call without waiting for confirmation. Then he looked back at Tessa, standing there in rumpled house staff clothes, her hair still fallen loose from holding the babies on the floor, the bruise peeking beneath her cuff, and he said something she didn't expect. From now on, you sleep in the room next to the nursery. If anything is unusual, you call me directly, not through anyone else. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize for dragging her in like a suspect. He only set new rules, and Adrian Knox's rules didn't need explanations. They only needed obedience. Tessa nodded once and headed for the door, but just before her hand touched the knob, Adrian's voice came from behind her, low, even, and cold as unsharpened steel. Tessa. She stopped, without turning around. That name, he said. Sooner or later I'll know it. And when I do, that person will wish they'd never set foot in this house. The door closed behind Tessa, and in the dim office, Adrian Knox stood alone amid papers and maps. But his mind wasn't on shipping lanes or docks at all. It stayed with the image of 2 infants lying on a cold floor, and a stranger holding them in his place. Their father by blood, the man who'd paid for a whole team of nannies, security, and household staff, yet still let his children cry in the dark without ever knowing. He bent forward, both hands planted on the desk, and for the first time in many months, Adrian Knox felt something heavier than power pressing down on his chest. It was shame. The shame didn't last more than 5 minutes in Adrian Knox's mind, because he didn't have the luxury of sitting with his feelings while the empire was shaking right under his feet. The wall clock in his office read 4:47 in the morning when the door opened and Grant Mercer walked in. No knock, no waiting to be invited. Because when Adrian called on the private line, every courtesy got erased and replaced with speed. Grant didn't come alone. Behind him were 2 men in dark suits, collars open, eyes bruised with sleeplessness, but backs still straight. The capo overseeing the southern dock line and a crew chief in charge of warehouse logistics. Faces that never appeared on any business card, and yet decided how millions of dollars moved every night across the inky water of Lake Michigan. Adrian didn't greet them, didn't offer a seat. He simply swept the paperwork on his desk to the side and spread out a map, the kind printed by hand on thick paper, never shown on any electronic screen. Because Adrian Knox understood that pixels could be hacked, but paper only burned when he wanted it to burn. The map covered the dock routes and harbor points from the Calumet area out to the edge of Burnham, each line marked in a color code: red for active routes, blue for backups, black for dead ones. And tonight, 2 red routes had been crossed out in pencil. Grant opened a small leather notebook and began to speak, his voice dry and exact, like reading a financial statement. A shipment from Pier 14 was supposed to reach the warehouse at 1 o'clock in the morning, a container labeled on the outside as construction equipment, but in reality carrying a load worth nearly $2 million. It didn't arrive. No GPS signal, no contact with the receiving team, and by 3 o'clock in the morning, Pier 14 was empty, as if no one had ever set foot there. The Southern Line capo added, his voice heavy and bitter, that this wasn't the first time. 2 weeks earlier, a smaller load had vanished from Pier 11. Back then, he'd assumed it was a shipping mistake and kept it as an internal report. But now, 2 times in a row wasn't a mistake anymore. This was a cutoff, and it was systematic. Adrian listened and said nothing. He used his index finger to trace a line on the map from Pier 11 to Pier 14, then dragged it up north toward where a rival's route lay, and he understood immediately what the drawing was saying. Someone was slowly licking up his territory from the bottom, pier by pier, night by night, like a snake swallowing its prey from the tail. But what made Adrian truly clamp his jaw wasn't the lost cargo. Money could be earned back. It was the way it disappeared. Too clean, too perfectly timed, the right route, the right shift. Grant spoke the thing everyone in the room was thinking, but no one wanted to say. Someone inside our house is selling the schedule. The office fell into silence, the kind where if anyone breathed too hard, they'd be stared at like a suspect. Adrian looked at each face, slowly, unhurried, as if he were taking a mental photograph of every man and filing it away in a private memory where everything stayed recorded and nothing ever got erased. Then he stood, rolled the map, slid it into a locked drawer, and said, his voice neither rising nor falling, flat as a frozen lake in Chicago in mid-January. I'm going down to the docks tonight. I'll see it with my own eyes. I'll check it with my own hands. Grant looked up. There was a flicker of objection in his eyes, but he swallowed it, because he knew that when Adrian Knox said I, there wasn't room for but. Adrian turned to Grant, and the next order wasn't for the harbor. It was for the mansion. While I'm gone, tighten security on the entire house. No one goes into the children's rooms except Tessa Hart. The new door code is known by only 3 people, me, her, and you. Switch the hallway cameras on the children's floor to continuous recording. No breaks, no overwriting. If anything happens in this house while I'm not here, you're the first person I question, Grant, and you know what it means when I say I question. Grant nodded once. Solid and sharp, no extra words. The 2 capos stood, understanding the meeting was over, not with a goodbye, but with Adrian's footsteps heading for the door. He took the black coat hanging behind it and pulled it onto his shoulders, and before he stepped into the dark hallway, he paused for exactly 1 beat, looking back toward the staircase leading up to the children's floor, where a few hours earlier he'd seen Tessa on the floor holding his 2 children. And in his eyes then, there was something new. Not control, not command, but the real fear of a man who realized the enemy wasn't only cutting his cargo lines out at the docks, but might be sitting inside this very house, only a few steps from his children. Adrian stepped into the darkness. A black car was already running, waiting outside the gate, and the Knox estate closed behind him like a fortress clenching its jaw, bracing for the worst. A black car tore through Chicago's empty streets at 5 o'clock in the morning, the pavement slick with night fog reflecting the dull yellow sodium lights like thin streaks of watered-down blood stretching toward the harbor. Adrian sat in the back seat and didn't say a word through 20 minutes of driving. His eyes locked on his phone screen, where Evan Pike, his driver and runner, had already sent the exact coordinates of Pier 14 and photos of the area from 3 hours earlier, hollow and bare, no containers, no fresh tire marks, as if a $2 million shipment had never existed at all. The car stopped at the edge of the docks on the south side of Calumet, where the smell of lake water mixed with motor oil and rusted metal, turning into a heavy air only people who live by the harbor can stand. Adrian stepped out, his black coat covering him like a shell, Evan behind him with 2 more from the logistics crew. No one carrying a weapon in the open, but the way they moved, shoulders low, hands never far from their hips, said every one of them was ready for the worst. Pier 14 sat silent, between 2 rows of containers stacked 3 levels high. Adrian walked straight into the mooring area, his eyes sweeping every detail. The container lock still intact, but the security seal had been swapped, the new seal whiter, the code not matching the Knox system, and he knew at once that someone had opened it, stripped it clean, then sealed it again like nothing had happened, clean enough that an amateur couldn't have done it. This was an inside hand. Evan led him to a lead, a man named Marco, not Knox crew, a freelance dock loader working the night shift in this zone, the kind of man who knows everything that moves through a port because he survives by watching and staying quiet. But tonight he couldn't stay quiet because the Knox crew paid for that silence, and when the cargo vanished, the money vanished with it. Marco leaned against a container, eyes darting, sweat beading on his forehead even though the cold cut to the bone, and he said, his voice lightly trembling, that around 12:30 last night, 2 unmarked trucks came in through the east side service gate, a gate that should have been locked, but last night it was open. He watched strangers move the cargo from container 14 into the trucks in under 40 minutes, fast, organized, and on the sleeve of one of them, he'd caught a glimpse of a tattoo he recognized, the mark of Nolan Vance's pipeline, the boss who controlled the North Dock routes, the man who'd kept an unspoken boundary with Knox for a long time. But tonight that boundary had clearly been erased. Adrian listened without changing expression, without the kind of anger that bursts into flame. He only drew 1 slow breath, then asked Marco a single question. The east service gate. Who holds the key? Marco swallowed. Your people. 2 words. heavier than any shipment that had ever passed through this pier. Adrian turned and looked at Evan, and that look was an order that didn't need speech. Evan understood at once. He pulled out his phone, called back to the logistics lead, and told him to trace the list of who held the East Gate key, who signed for it, who handed off shift, who was on site after 10 at night. Then Adrian faced Marco again, and this time he stepped closer, close enough for Marco to catch the cold cologne on his coat, and he said, not as a threat but as fact, that Marco had seen what he wasn't supposed to see, and now he had two choices. Either he forgot tonight completely and kept collecting the monthly envelopes from Knox crew, or he remembered one more detail for anyone else, and the name Marco would vanish from every night shift roster on every Chicago dock, not because he'd been fired. Marco nodded over and over, so fast his neck almost snapped, and Adrian walked away, not needing to hear anything more. He had enough. Nolan Vance was encroaching, not with muscle from the outside, but with keys from the inside, and that meant this war wouldn't explode out on the docks. It would explode in the heart of the Knox organization. Adrian was walking back toward the car when his private line vibrated. Not Grant, not a capo, but the mansion's internal number, the nursery line. He answered and heard Tessa's voice, small but sharp, trying to stay calm, though her breathing was quicker than usual. Mr. Knox, I need you to listen to me. There are pre-mixed bottles in the nursery fridge. I took one out for Owen at 4, but when I opened the cap I smelled something strange. Not spoiled milk. Different. Stronger. I didn't dare feed him. I put the bottle back untouched. Adrian stopped mid-step in the wind sweeping off the harbor. And in that instant, between motor oil and lake water, between empty containers and the trace of an enemy that had just licked across his territory, he felt something clamp his chest harder than any punch he'd ever taken in his life. Someone wasn't just cutting his shipping lanes. They weren't just planting people inside his organization. They were reaching into the heart of his home, into what his growing infant put in their mouths every day. Adrian gripped the phone so tightly the casing creaked, and when he spoke it was only 3 words, low, dense, and heavy as lead. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming home now. Tessa didn't wait for Adrian to come home before she moved. The moment she hung up, she called Grant Mercer on the internal number Adrian had given her earlier and told him exactly what she knew. The bottle in the nursery fridge smelled wrong. She hadn't fed Owen. She'd left everything exactly as it was. Grant showed up at the nursery door in less than 4 minutes. So fast, Tessa understood he hadn't been sleeping, and maybe from the moment Adrian left the estate, Grant had been circling the halls nonstop like a wolf, guarding the den while the pack leader hunted. But when he stepped inside, the first thing Grant did wasn't look at the bottle. It was look at Tessa, and his eyes didn't hide anything. They were full of suspicion. "You're the only one allowed in this room besides me and the boss," Grant said, his voice flat, like he was reading an indictment. "You're also the one who noticed something was wrong with the bottle. Do you see how convenient that is?" Tessa held his stare and she didn't argue, didn't plead her case. She said only one sentence. "If I did it, I wouldn't call anyone. I'd pour the bottle out and no one would ever know." Grant went silent for 3 seconds, weighing the logic in his head. Then he stepped past her to the fridge, opened it, took the bottle using a cloth so he didn't touch it directly, smelled it, and his face changed, just slightly, but enough for Tessa to see that he smelled what she'd smelled too, that sharp scent buried under the formula, something that didn't belong to any ingredient on an infant nutrition label. Grant sealed the bottle in a zip bag, called for the entire secondary kitchen where the milk was mixed and stored to be locked down, then posted 2 security staff at the kitchen door and the nursery door, no one in or out until Adrian returned. He still didn't tell Tessa she was trusted, but he also didn't order her out of the nursery, and that silence was the clearest answer Grant Mercer could give right now. Adrian got back to the estate just as daylight began to show, a dull gray dawn slipping through the glass of the security room as he sat in front of 4 surveillance monitors and started rewinding the footage from the hallway camera on the children's floor and the secondary kitchen. Caleb Rowe, the head of the security team, stood beside him working the system, rolling back frame by frame from 10 o'clock the previous night to 4 o'clock in the morning. The moment Tessa discovered the bottle, the children's floor hallway was clear on the screen. Lights dim, no movement, normal, until the timestamp of 1:17 in the morning. At that exact moment, right when the camera angle covered the secondary kitchen door, the screen jumped. Not static, Not a signal glitch, but a complete cut to black for exactly 12 seconds. Then it returned to normal. And when the image came back, everything looked the same as before. An empty hallway, dim lights, not a single shadow. But those 12 seconds were a black hole that swallowed all evidence. Adrian looked at Caleb. 12 seconds. Deleted or overwritten. Caleb checked the system log, fingers tapping the keyboard, then answered, his voice heavy. Active deletion. Someone accessed the system through an internal account, used the backup code, the kind that's issued only to night shift security. This wasn't a technical error. This was intentional. Adrian stood up slowly, and that slowness was more dangerous than any burst of anger, because it meant he was calculating, not reacting. He ordered Caleb to pull the full list of security staff who had been issued backup codes, match it to last night's schedule, who was on duty, who was off, who swapped shifts, who asked permission to step out. Everything had to be on his desk within 1 hour. Then he turned to Grant. That bottle, send it to Dr. Bishop for testing immediately this morning. I want to know what's in it. Every component. Every milligram. Grant nodded, slid the zip bag into his briefcase, and walked out. Adrian stayed in the security room alone with Caleb, replaying those 12 black seconds again and again, as if staring long enough would let him see through the darkness and into the face of the person who dared to walk into his kitchen, touch his child's bottle, and vanish into a 12-second void without leaving a trace. He was rearranging every piece in his mind: the docs, the side gate key, the schedule, the backup code. Nolan Vance, when the knock came at the security room door, light and hurried. A morning shift guard stood outside holding a white envelope. No sender name, no stamp, no postmark. Mr. Knox, this slid under the front door about 10 minutes ago. No one saw who dropped it. Adrian took the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside was a high-quality color photograph, shot from an angle that could only be inside the estate, a view from near the nursery door. In the picture, Tessa was holding both babies, Eli tucked neatly in her left arm, Owen pressed against the right side of her chest, and Tessa's face in that moment was so soft she looked like their biological mother. Beneath the photo, handwritten in black ink, were 2 short English words: "Nice family." Adrian held the picture, and his fingers didn't shake, but his jaw tightened until the muscle at his temple bunched under the skin. And his eyes as he looked at those words weren't the eyes of a boss who'd lost cargo at the docks, or a father learning all over again how to care for his children. They were the eyes of an animal realizing the hunter wasn't just outside the fence. The hunter was already inside. It had seen everything. It had photographed a moment that should have belonged only to the 4 walls of the nursery, and now it was sending it back like a statement that nothing in the Knox estate was safe. No one was invisible, and this game had only just begun. Adrian set the photo down on the desk, face down, as if he couldn't stand to see Tessa holding his children for 1 more second in this context. A context where that image was no longer a warm moment, but proof that an enemy was breathing right behind his neck. He left the security room and went straight up to the nursery floor, walked past 2 guards on post without looking at them, pushed open the nursery door, and found Tessa sitting in the rocking chair beside Owen's crib, her hand patting the baby's back in a steady rhythm, her eyes bruised with sleeplessness, yet her hand never stopping, like a machine powered by instinct instead of an employment contract. Tessa. Adrian's voice wasn't as cold as it had been in his office last night, but it wasn't warm either. It lived in the space between, where an order could be disguised as patience running out. I need that name. Right now. Tessa looked up at him, and she saw the photo in his hand, the one he'd just turned face down, now lifted for her to see, a picture of her holding Eli and Owen, the words "nice family" printed underneath. The blood drained from Tessa's face in a single breath. She understood at once this wasn't about the bruise on her wrist anymore, or about protecting someone from Adrian Knox's anger. This was about life and death, and her silence wasn't shielding anyone now. It was turning into a shield for the very person stabbing from behind. "Holt," she said, 1 word, light as breath and heavy as a hammer. "Holt Rigsby. He came into the nursery the night before last. I stopped him and asked what he needed. He said he was checking on orders from the boss. I told him no one goes into the nursery without being on the schedule. He shoved me into the wall, squeezed my wrist, and said if I opened my mouth, he'd make sure I disappeared from this mansion before dawn, without anyone needing to sign termination papers." Adrian said nothing for 10 seconds, and those 10 seconds stretched so long, Tessa could hear Owen's steady breathing in the crib, the clock ticking on the wall, the wind whining outside the window. But she couldn't hear Adrian breathe at all, because he was holding it the way a man holds it when he's forcing all his fury down beneath his breastbone, so it won't erupt right now. Not here. Not where 2 babies are sleeping. Then he turned and walked out, pulled his private line, and dialed Grant. "Bring Holt Rigsby to my office. Immediately. Don't give a reason." 20 minutes later, Holt Rigsby walked into Adrian Knox's office with a smile on his mouth. The kind of smile worn by a man used to sitting at the boss's table, convinced that partner status meant he could step anywhere he wanted in this mansion. Holt was 40, haircut close, gray suit, a ring on his pinky, his stride confident to the point of arrogance. And when he saw Adrian behind the desk with the photo turned face up on the wood, the smile didn't disappear. It only changed shape, from confidence into appraisal. "Knox, calling me at 6 in the morning means this has to be big." Adrian didn't invite him to sit, didn't pour a drink, didn't shake his hand. He only asked one question. "What were you doing in the nursery the night before last?" Holt's smile froze for exactly half a second, then melted away, replaced by a lazy shrug. "I walked by, got curious, stopped in to look at the 2 little guys." "What's the big deal?" "You shoved my staff member into a wall. You gripped her wrist. You threatened her." Holt looked at Adrian, and this time he didn't smile at all. He tilted his head, his eyes sharpening like a blade, and he spoke in the kind of voice only men too comfortable with darkness would dare use in front of Adrian Knox. "That maid? She told you?" Holt snorted. "Knox, I've known you since you were running cargo at Pier 12. I didn't think I'd live to see the day I had to explain myself over a girl who mops floors. Or has the boss got a weak spot now?" The office fell into a silence so thick the air itself seemed to stop moving. Adrian came around the desk and faced Holt, the distance between them less than an arm's length, and he spoke, each word clear as if carved in stone. "Our cooperation ends this moment. Every bit of your access to this mansion, to my systems, to my dock routes, is revoked immediately. You have 30 minutes to leave before I have Grant escort you in a way you won't enjoy." Holt stared at Adrian, not afraid, but not smiling anymore either. His face held the quick math of a man weighing whether to strike back or retreat. And he chose retreat, because Holt Rigsby knew how to fight, but he also knew how to count. And in this room, he was standing alone on Knox territory, with Grant Mercer surely waiting just outside the door. Holt fastened his suit jacket again, adjusted the ring on his pinky, and headed for the exit. But right before he stepped out, he stopped, turned back to Adrian, and spoke as lightly as if he were commenting on the weather. "Knox, you can throw me out, sure, but I'm not the rat. The rat's in your house, eating your food, sleeping under your roof, and you've just handed it the key to your kid's room." The door shut. Holt's footsteps faded down the hall, and Adrian stood alone in his office, Holt's last words echoing in his head like a cracked bell, because Adrian knew Holt could be a bastard, but bastards sometimes tell the truth. And if the rat really was inside the house, eating his food, sleeping under his roof, then he hadn't locked the mansion down to keep the enemy out. He'd locked it to trap the enemy in, along with his children. The estate fell silent after Holt left. The heavy silence of a house that had just expelled a piece of its past and didn't yet know what the future would still throw onto its roof. Adrian didn't go back to his office. He didn't call Grant. He didn't rewind cameras or comb through another list. Instead, he did something he couldn't even explain with logic. He went up to the children's floor. The nursery door opened, and Tessa was standing beside Eli's crib, an electronic thermometer in her hand, just pulled from under the baby's arm, her brow tightening as she read the number on the screen. 38.2, she murmured softly. Not to Adrian because she didn't know he was behind her, but to herself, the habit of someone who'd grown used to caring for children alone in the night, with no one to talk things through with. Adrian stepped in, and Tessa turned, startled for a beat but not retreating, only lowering her voice. "Eli's still running a low fever. I've wiped him down with warm water twice. He'll nurse, but less than usual." Adrian looked into the crib, looked at Eli, the vulnerable infant curled beneath a thin blanket, cheeks flushed from fever, lips parted, tiny fist clenched as if he were holding tight to something invisible in his sleep. And Adrian realized this was the first time he'd truly stood beside his child's crib long enough to see every detail like that. Since his wife died after the delivery, Adrian had built a wall between himself and the two babies, not because he didn't love them, but because every time he looked at them, he saw her. He saw their mother's eyes, their mother's nose, the way Eli furrowed his brow when uncomfortable, exactly like she used to furrow hers when she argued with him, and that pain was so large he chose the easiest thing a powerful man could choose. He hired replacements. He paid for someone else's presence so he wouldn't have to be present. But tonight, after the docs, after the bottle, after the photograph, after Holt, every layer of insulation he'd built had been torn open, and he was standing here, stripped bare in front of two cribs, not knowing what to do. "Can I hold him?" Adrian asked. And his voice was so different Tessa almost didn't recognize it, because it wasn't a voice giving orders or demanding answers. It was the voice of a man asking permission, awkward and hesitant, almost painfully human. Tessa didn't say much. She stepped to Eli's crib, slid her hand beneath the baby's head and back, lifted him gently, then turned toward Adrian. "Put your left hand under his head, your right hand under his bottom. Hold him against your chest. Not too tight, but not loose. He needs to feel held." Adrian followed, each movement stiff, like someone holding something so precious he was afraid it would break. And when Eli settled against his chest, the small fever heat of the baby's body came through Adrian's dress shirt into his skin. Adrian went still. He didn't shift. He didn't breathe too hard, as if any movement might shatter the moment. "What do you do when he has a fever?" he asked, eyes never leaving Eli. Tessa guided him gently. "Wipe the baby's forehead with a warm cloth. Offer small feeds. Check the temperature every hour. Don't let the room get too hot, and don't let it get too cold. If it climbed above 38.5, call Dr. Bishop immediately." Adrian nodded at every word, as if he were memorizing the most important set of codes he'd ever been given. Then Owen cried, that distinct, raspy cry rising from the crib beside them, and Tessa crossed over to pick Owen up while Adrian still held Eli. And for the first time in this nursery, both babies were being held at the same time by two adults. Not a nanny on a shift, not staff doing their hours and leaving, but two human beings standing there because they chose to stand there. Tessa watched Adrian bend his face closer to Eli, and she saw something she never expected to see in the Chicago Mafia boss. A breaking. The kind with no bone-snapping sound, no visible wound, only the eyes of a man looking at his child with guilt filling the space. Guilt for missing 3 months, 90 days, more than 2,000 hours he should have been here. Adrian stood there holding his baby, and the nursery began to feel warmer, not because anyone adjusted the heat, but because for the first time, something right was happening in this house. Owen quieted. Eli's breathing steadied. Tessa sat in the rocking chair with Owen in her arms, and Adrian sat down on the floor beside the crib because the nursery didn't have a second chair, and he didn't want to leave to get one. The moment so fragile he was afraid that if he stepped out of the room, it would vanish. But the moment lasted exactly 17 minutes. Adrian's private line phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out with one hand, while the other still held Eli, and the screen showed a message from an unknown number. No name, no recognizable area code. And when he opened it, the line on the screen wasn't long. Only 8 English words, but each word weighed like a bullet. "Give up the dock routes, or give up your children." Adrian stared at the screen, then looked down at Eli asleep against his chest, then looked over at Tessa holding Owen by the rocking chair, and he understood the enemy didn't just know he had 2 children. They knew he'd only just begun to love them, and they meant to use that newborn love as a noose around his throat. He locked the screen, slid the phone back into his pocket, and he didn't tell Tessa about the message, but his arms tightened around Eli, just enough not to wake him, but enough for Adrian to feel that his child was still breathing, still warm, still here, and he would do anything, burn anything, bury anyone, to make sure that didn't change. The extortion text changed everything in less than an hour. Adrian didn't reply to that unknown number. He never answered an enemy with words. He answered with action. And his first move was to turn the Knox mansion from a home into a fortress. Grant got direct orders at 7 in the morning, and by 9 everything had changed completely. The main gate locked with 2 layers, an electronic lock and a backup mechanical bolt. The perimeter cameras increased from 12 to 21 points, covering every blind spot that had previously been watched only by human eyes. The daytime security team doubled, and the night shift split into 2 rotating patrol groups, so no one stayed in one place too long. Every side door welded shut except the main kitchen door and the west service door, with only Grant and Caleb Rowe holding the codes. Caleb audited the entire electronic security system, upgraded the camera protocols so no one could erase footage with a backup code anymore, and every system access action was now recorded in double logs, one copy on the internal server, and one copy on an external drive, locked inside the safe in Adrian's office. The Knox mansion now breathed in a security rhythm. Every door opening and closing came with a confirming beep. Every figure moving through the hallways was captured on camera, and the air inside the house felt heavier, but tighter too, like a porcupine curled up with its quills pointing outward, waiting for whoever dared to touch it. But Adrian knew a fortress didn't survive on thick walls and cameras alone. It needed a last resort for the worst-case scenario, and that resort lived in the basement. That afternoon, he took Tessa downstairs for the first time, through a hidden secondary stairwell behind a bookcase on the first-floor corridor, down one level, left turn, to a steel door with no handle, only a 6-digit keypad and a fingerprint scanner slot. "This is the panic room," Adrian said, his voice calm, as if he were introducing an ordinary guest room, but his eyes were anything but ordinary. Steel walls, soundproofing, a separate ventilation system, drinking water stocked for 3 days, formula, diapers, infant fever reducer, a satellite phone that connects straight to Grant and to me. If anything happens, anything at all, you take the boys and you come in here. The code is 6 digits. I'll say it once, and you will remember it. No writing it down, no saving it in your phone. He spoke the 6 numbers and Tessa repeated them, exactly, without needing to hear them again, and Adrian looked at her with an expression Tessa couldn't decode, something like respect and something like fear, as if he were placing his children's lives in her hands, and the fact that he had to place them there hurt him. Tessa stepped into the panic room and studied it, committing every position to memory. A fold-up crib in the left corner, formula and purified water lined along the right wall, the satellite phone fixed on a mounted shelf beside the door, the interior lock button, and the emergency release marked in red that glowed in the dark. She practiced opening the door from the outside with the code and fingerprint twice, practiced locking it from the inside once, and Adrian stood there watching her drill with the face of a man, hoping none of this would ever be needed, while knowing hope doesn't protect anyone. That night a snowstorm slammed into Chicago, the kind the weather reports had warned about for 2 days, but no one expected it to arrive so early and so violently. Wind screaming over the mansion roof like wolves howling, snow falling so thick the first-floor windows were whitewashed in 2 hours, and the temperature dropping to the point where breath froze the instant it left the lips. Tessa stayed in the nursery with the boys, the fireplace running steady, wrapping an extra blanket around Eli because he still had a mild fever, and his body temperature swung harder than Owen's when the weather changed this suddenly. Everything stayed quiet until 11:43 at night, when the entire Knox mansion sank into darkness. A power outage. Not a gradual loss, not lights flickering and dying, but an instant blackout, all at once, as if someone had yanked the mansion's plug from the world. The nursery went pitch black, the fireplace died, the hallway lights cut out, and in that darkness, Tessa heard a short beep from the security system. The warning beep for main power loss before the backup generator engaged. 12 seconds. Tessa counted in her head, because she had nothing else to hold on to except numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The darkness so thick it felt like weight pressing on her skin. 6, 7, 8. Owen started to cry, the rasping cry filling a room with no light. 9, 10. Tessa pulled Owen tight with one arm and reached with the other to touch Eli's crib, to make sure he was still there. 11, 12, and then the lights snapped back on. The backup generator wailed and steadied. The fireplace restarted. The cameras blinked and returned to normal. And everything seemed intact. But those 12 seconds were 12 blind seconds. The cameras didn't record. The electronic locks lost signal. The magnetic gates didn't work. And anyone already inside, or trying to get inside, during those 12 seconds was invisible. Tessa held Owen, set him back into the crib beside Eli, then walked to the nursery door and pressed her ear to the wood, listening. The hallway outside was silent. The lights were on again. The cameras were running again. But just as she was about to turn back to the cribs, she heard it. Not wind, not machinery, but footsteps, light, slow, steady, moving along the nursery floor hallway toward the door where she stood. Those weren't security footsteps, because security wore hard shoes that would thud on wood. This was soft, like socks or bare feet. The footsteps of someone who didn't want to be heard. Tessa backed up 2 steps, her eyes darting to the 2 cribs where Eli and Owen lay, then back to the nursery door, and in her mind, the 6 digits of the panic room code lit up like neon. She knew the hidden stairwell was at the end of the hall. Turn left. She knew she could scoop up both boys and make it there in under 30 seconds if she moved fast enough. But to reach the stairwell, she would have to open the nursery door and step into the very hallway where those unknown footsteps were coming closer, closer, closer. Tessa didn't wait another second. The survival instinct inside her screamed that anyone walking barefoot on the children's floor hallway near midnight in the middle of a blizzard wasn't a good person. And she couldn't afford to be wrong, not when Eli and Owen were lying less than 3 steps from that door. She spun back to the cribs, lifted Eli with her left arm and Owen with her right, both babies pressed to her chest. Owen started crying louder from the sudden jolt, but Tessa didn't soothe him. She didn't have time to soothe him. She only held tight and rushed for the nursery's side door, the small door that connected into the adjoining bedroom Adrian had set up for her. She kicked it open with her foot, ran straight through her room, out into the eastern branch hallway, then turned left toward the secondary staircase, hidden behind the bookcase. Her steps were fast but not frantic, because she'd counted it in her head since the afternoon. 14 steps from the nursery to the staircase. Turn left. Down 1 floor, the keypad to the right of the steel door, and she'd practiced opening it twice earlier, her muscles remembering the route, even when her eyes were nearly blind in a corridor lit only by the pale yellow spill of emergency lights. She set her hand on the keypad, entered 6 digits, scanned her fingerprint, the steel door slid open, and Tessa slipped inside with both babies against her chest, hit the lock button that glowed red. The door sealed with a hiss of compressed air, and the safe room swallowed 3 lives into its soundproof armored belly. Tessa laid Eli and Owen into the fold-out crib, her hands shaking, but she forced them to stop. She lifted the satellite phone from its cradle, pressed 1, Adrian's number, and waited. Down on the estate's ground floor, everything ignited at once. 2 dark figures had entered the house during the 12-second blackout through the western service door, the only door still functional because someone had disabled its lock code right before the main power was cut. They moved toward the children's floor, one taking the main hallway, and it was the soft footfalls of that one that warned Tessa, while the second took the western side staircase to block the escape route. But they hadn't counted on 2 things. One was that Tessa ran before they reached the nursery door. The second was that Adrian Knox didn't stay at the docks that night, because he was already on his way back, after a call with Grant confirming the blizzard would collapse the area power grid, and the moment his car passed the front gate, his private line vibrated with the panic room signal. Adrian entered through the main entrance with his gun already chambered, Grant 3 steps behind him, Evan Pike holding the outer gate. The backup camera system had come back online, and Caleb Rowe reported through the earpiece from the basement security room that there were 2 unfamiliar heat signatures on the 2nd floor, one in the main hallway near the nursery, one at the western side staircase. Adrian went up the main stairs, his pace neither rushed nor slow, steady as a clock's beat. And when he reached the top of the 2nd floor corridor, the first intruder was standing at the nursery door, now open, staring into an empty room, 2 empty cribs, no babies, no Tessa. And in the instant the man turned, Adrian was already there, 4 steps away, gun leveled straight. The gunshot cracked through the children's hallway, 1 clean shot into the intruder's right shoulder. The man went down, the weapon in his hand skittering away, and Grant lunged in, drove him to the floor, and bound his hands. The second intruder at the western staircase heard the shot and turned to run, but Caleb had sealed the service door from the security room, trapping him between the stairs and the steel door, Evan Pike cutting him off from below, and he was taken alive in less than 2 minutes. Adrian dragged the first man, the one with the shattered shoulder, into a sitting slump against the hallway wall, blood soaking through black fabric and spreading across the oak floor, and Adrian looked down at his face, young, maybe not yet 30, eyes wide not with pain but with fear, and on the man's wrist, exposed when his sleeve rode up during the struggle, was the tattoo Adrian had heard Marco describe at the docks, the mark of Nolan Vance's pipeline, a broken circle slashed by 3 diagonal lines, a loyalty tattoo every member of the Vance organization carried on their skin like a vow without words. Adrian crouched, fisted the man's collar, and asked in a voice that, if death had a sound, would sound like this. Who gave the order? Vance or someone else? The intruder looked at Adrian, his mouth moving, and then instead of speaking, he made a motion no one could stop. He bit down on something hidden in the back of his teeth, a small capsule, and in less than 10 seconds his eyes rolled back. White foam spilled at the corners of his mouth. His body convulsed twice, then went slack. Dead. Grant surged in, checked for a pulse, and shook his head. Adrian straightened, staring at the corpse at his feet, and he understood this wasn't an ordinary hired hand. This was the kind trained to die rather than talk, the kind only extremely rigid organizations produced, and that meant Nolan Vance was playing far bigger than Adrian had thought. The second man, bound downstairs, wore the exact same tattoo, but he was still alive, and Grant had already stuffed cloth in his mouth before he could bite anything. Adrian ordered him held in a sealed room in the basement to be questioned later, because right now there was something else Adrian needed to do first. He went down to the panic room, entered the code, the door opened, and Tessa was sitting inside with both babies in her arms, her eyes dry because she wasn't crying. She didn't have time to cry when 2 lives were leaning on her, and when she saw Adrian standing in the doorway, his dress shirt smeared with blood that wasn't his eyes cold but his shoulders loosening by the smallest fraction when he saw the babies safe. Tessa said only one sentence, "They're fine." Adrian nodded, and that nod carried more than any thank you he could say. Then he returned to the security room, and Caleb handed him new information. Not from inside the estate, but from outside. From a source Grant had planted in the federal system. The FBI was opening a RICO file targeting the Knox organization. Agent Howard Greer, the name Adrian had been hearing in rumors for 6 months, had officially been assigned to lead the case, and the first document gathered into the file was a manifest of the Southern Calumet dock routes, the very route Adrian had just lost cargo on, the very route the rival was pushing into, as if someone had delivered the perfect puzzle piece at the perfect moment so the vice could close from both sides. Vance pressing from the outside in, and the FBI squeezing from above down, and Adrian Knox stood in the middle, in a mansion that had just been breached, beside a dead man who'd taken poison, and a prisoner who couldn't speak, with the developing twins sleeping in a steel room beneath the basement, and a housekeeper he now owed more than any debt he'd ever written into a ledger. 2 days after the break-in, the Knox mansion still carried the smell of bleach on the second-floor hallway's wood floors, where the blood had been wiped away. But the mark it left in everyone's mind was something no chemical could scrub out. The body of the one who took his own life had been handled through Grant's private channel. No police, no report, no trace. That was how Adrian Knox's world worked. Death inside his house existed only until he decided it didn't exist anymore. The second man was still being held in a sealed room in the basement. He hadn't said a single word even after Grant questioned him for 12 hours in ways Tessa didn't want to know the details of. He only stared at the ceiling and stayed silent with the calm of someone who had already accepted whatever ending was coming. And that calm was more frightening than any threat, because it said the person behind him was more terrifying than anything Adrian Knox could do. But Adrian didn't have time to press harder, because a second front had opened, and this one didn't use guns or midnight footsteps. It used paperwork, numbers, and the law. Grant walked into Adrian's office at 7 in the morning on the 3rd day with an expression that, if Tessa had seen it, she would have described as the face of a man who had just swallowed something brutally bitter and wasn't allowed to spit it out. He set a laptop on the desk, opened it, and showed Adrian what he'd discovered at 3 that morning while auditing the financial system on routine orders. The Knox organization's clean account, the kind laundered through 3 layers of shell companies and known in its original form only to Adrian, Grant, and the chief accountant, had been accessed from an unknown device 4 days earlier. On the same night, the camera system went dark for 12 seconds. The intruder didn't withdraw money. He didn't transfer funds. He didn't do anything that would trigger the bank's alerts. He only copied everything. The entire transaction history, the shell company names, the intermediary account numbers, the monthly inflows and outflows, the complete financial map of the Knox empire captured in a single access session that lasted less than 3 minutes. Grant spoke in a voice he tried to keep flat, but the tight set of his jaw betrayed the calm. Someone in this house is selling our books to the outside. If this reaches the FBI, a RICO case won't be a potential threat anymore. It'll become an arrest warrant. Adrian stared at the screen, at the numbers he'd spent years building and laundering to hide, now lying open like exposed organs. And he understood this wasn't 2 separate wars. Vance and the FBI weren't 2 enemies striking at the same time by coincidence. This was a designed pincer, Vance hit from the outside with break-ins, kidnappings, and extortion to keep Adrian scrambling on defense, while an insider burrowed deep and fed documents to the FBI so the law could deliver the final blow. 2 blades, one from the street, one from a federal courtroom, and both aimed at the heart. Adrian ordered Grant to freeze every clean account and move funds through a backup system known only to him and Grant, and at the same time to list everyone who could access high-level financial information. The list wasn't long, only 5 people: the chief accountant, 2 capos who handled doc income and payouts, Caleb Rowe, because he managed the security systems where data was stored, and one name Grant didn't want to say but had to, because logic didn't allow omissions, and anyone with physical access near the internal server area, Grant added, including household staff along the first-floor east corridor, where the auxiliary server sits inside the utility cabinet. Adrian looked at Grant, and they both knew that first-floor east corridor was where the laundry room, the secondary kitchen, and the staff rooms were, where Tessa Hart had been before she was moved to the room beside the nursery. Grant hadn't even gotten another word out when Caleb radioed in to report that during the morning security sweep, his team had found a burner phone and a small USB drive hidden inside a coat pocket hanging in Tessa's old room, the room she'd left, though her personal belongings hadn't all been moved out yet. Caleb brought both items up to the office and set them on the desk, and Grant plugged the USB into an isolated computer. Inside was a copy of the clean accounts transaction history, the same data that had been copied, the same format, the same date, as if someone had carefully planted evidence where, once it was found, every eye would turn in one direction only. Tessa. Adrian picked up the USB and rolled it between 2 fingers, and he didn't speak for 30 seconds. He was thinking, peeling this trap apart layer by layer like disarming a bomb, because he knew that if this really was an insider, no one was stupid enough to hide evidence in their own room, but he also knew Grant couldn't see that, because Grant was looking through the eyes of a man protecting an organization, and through those eyes, everyone from outside was a threat. Grant spoke again, his voice steel-hard and no less cold. "Boss, I've given her the benefit of doubt since the baby bottle incident, but now the evidence is in her room. She has access to the nursery. She can move freely in the house, and she's the only one added into the system after all this started. I recommend separating her from the kids immediately, detaining her, and getting answers before anything breaks further." Adrian set the USB back on the desk, looked at Grant, then looked out the window where snow still covered the mansion grounds like a vast burial shroud, and he thought of Tessa sitting in the panic room holding his sons for 40 minutes in the dark without crying, without shaking, without running off alone. He thought of her eyes when Eli's fever broke, of her hand patting Owen's back until the baby quieted, of her steady voice saying the boys were safe when the panic room door opened, and he knew instinct was telling him one thing, while the evidence was saying another. And in his world, betting wrong on trust could cost him everything, but betting wrong on suspicion could cost him the only thing keeping those 2 babies alive through each night. Adrian called Tessa into his office 15 minutes after Grant suggested separating her from the children, and when she walked in, everything was already laid out on the desk: the burner phone, the USB drive, and the look in Grant Mercer's eyes from the corner of the room, fixed on her the way a prosecutor looks at a defendant at the rail. Tessa looked down at the desk, at the 2 items, then back up at Adrian, and she didn't ask what it was, because she was smart enough to understand immediately that these things had been found among her belongings, and she was being suspected as the inside leak, the rat, the one who'd sold the Knox books to the outside. But Tessa Hart didn't beg. She didn't cry, didn't kneel, didn't say, "I swear I'm innocent," because she understood that in this world, oaths were cheaper than bullets, and Adrian Knox had seen too many tears to be moved by them. Instead, she spoke in a tone that even Grant had to notice, because it was strangely calm for someone standing in a Mafia boss's office with incriminating evidence sitting right in front of her. "Mr. Knox, I'm going to ask you one logical question before you decide anything. If I were an inside leak, would I have access to your financial system?" Adrian didn't answer, but both he and Grant knew the answer was no. Tessa was a housekeeper. She had no codes, no laptop, no access to anything beyond the nursery and the kitchen. "If I could copy data from your server, I'd need to know where the server is. I'd need a device to connect, and I'd need access credentials. Do I have any of those?" Again, no. Grant's mouth tightened, but he didn't cut her off. Tessa continued, "And if I were smart enough to steal financial data from an organization like the Knox House, I'd be smart enough not to hide the evidence in my own room, where any security sweep would find it in 5 minutes. The office went quiet, the kind of quiet where logic spoke louder than emotion. Then Tessa did something no one expected. She pulled a small notebook from her back pocket, hardcover, corners worn soft with age, and placed it on the desk beside the USB drive. This is Eli and Owen's health log. I've kept it since the first night I cared for them. Every page is one day, temperature, how much they fed, how many diaper changes, how long they slept, any unusual reactions. I write it by hand because I don't trust phones. I don't trust systems. I only trust ink on paper and what my eyes see. I write down exactly what happens. She opened it, turned to the page from the night the bottle smelled strange, where she'd recorded the exact time she noticed it, described the odor, noted what she did, and written, reported to Grant Mercer, reported to Mr. Knox. She turned to the page from the night of the break-in, the time the power went out, the time she moved the babies into the panic room, Eli's breathing in that moment, Owen's temperature when they came out of the safe room. Every page was proof that Tessa Hart wasn't living in this estate for a housekeeper's paycheck. She was here for 2 children, and she'd been tracking every breath with a care so meticulous that even a professional nanny paid 10 times her wage wouldn't have matched it. Adrian took the notebook and turned the pages slowly, and Tessa saw his finger stop on the entry that read, Eli fever at 38.5, fussy at 2:17 in the morning, wiped down with warm water, settled after 12 minutes, took 40 milliliters. That page was the first night, the night he found Tessa asleep on the floor with his 2 children, and he realized that while he sat in his office signing orders and counting money, this young woman had been counting every milliliter his baby drank. He set the notebook down, looked at Grant, and said, Tessa stays. Grant opened his mouth to argue, but Adrian kept speaking before Grant could make a sound. She stays, but inside the safety circle. From now on, she doesn't go anywhere alone in this house. Someone's with her at all times, not to watch her, but to protect her. Because if someone planted evidence in her room, she isn't the rat, she's the target, and I'm not letting a target walk around without cover. Grant watched Adrian for 3 seconds, reading something in his eyes he hadn't seen in 12 years at Adrian's side. Not softness, not confusion brought on by feelings, but calculation that had weighed instinct against logic and chosen a side. And that side was Tessa. Grant nodded once, solid and clipped as always, then walked out. Tessa stayed in the office, looking at Adrian, and she wanted to say thank you, but she didn't, because she knew he wasn't keeping her out of kindness. He was keeping her because his children needed her, and logic said she was innocent. But whatever the reason, tonight Eli and Owen would still have someone to hold them, and that was enough. She turned and left, went back to the nursery, sat down in the rocking chair beside Owen's crib, and pulled out her phone to check messages because she hadn't looked at it all morning. There was a new message from an unknown number. No name, no area code, the same kind of message Adrian had received the night he held Eli for the first time. Tessa opened it, and the 6 words on the screen burned through every shred of calm she'd held onto all morning in that office. Leave the Knox house or die. She stared at the screen, then looked at Owen's crib where he slept peacefully with his fist curled tight, then looked at Eli's crib where he shifted and frowned in his dream, and Tessa Hart, 28 years old, with no family, no support, nothing but her hands and her instincts, turned off the phone screen, slid it into her pocket, and didn't go anywhere. 3 days after the threatening text, Tessa was still in the Knox mansion. She still sat beside the boys' cribs every night. She still kept their health log 1 page at a time, and she didn't mention the 6 words on that phone screen to anyone, because she knew that if she said them out loud, then either Adrian would tighten security until she couldn't breathe, or Grant would use it as one more reason to push her out. And both endings meant Eli and Owen would lose the only person counting every milliliter of milk they drank each night. But the sender of the message didn't wait for Tessa to leave on her own. They had another plan, and that plan activated on the 4th night, on the exact shift where everything had been arranged from the inside. That night, Adrian wasn't at the mansion. He was down at the docks with Evan Pike, checking the backup route Grant had just built to replace 2 routes that had been cut. And before he left, he handed the mansion to Grant with a clear order. No one goes into the nursery except Tessa. Cameras run without interruption. Door codes stay unchanged. But there was one thing neither Adrian nor Grant anticipated. The nursery code was intact, but the secondary mechanical lock on the corridor door connecting the first floor to the second, the iron bolt Caleb had added after the last break-in, had already been opened from the inside at 6 in the evening, right as the shift changed. A shift change meant 5 minutes of handoff between two security teams. 5 minutes when the second-floor hallway had no human eyes, only cameras, and the cameras had already been fooled once. At 11:20 that night, Tessa was feeding Owen a bottle in the nursery when she heard footsteps. Not one person, but two. And this time, they weren't careful. They moved fast with purpose. Hard shoes hammering the wood floor in a rapid rhythm like war drums. She didn't need to count to 3 to react. Her body moved before her brain could issue an order. She set Owen against her left shoulder, lunged for Eli's crib, lifted him up, but her right hand still held the bottle. And the distance from the crib to the side door was farther than she remembered when she had to carry both babies at once, while the footsteps were splitting the hallway outside. The nursery door shuddered. Someone was punching in a code, but it was the wrong code. And then came the sound of a kick against the door. Hard, the wood jolting, but the electronic lock held, and Tessa knew she had no more than 30 seconds before they broke through. She had Owen on her left shoulder and was trying to hold Eli with her right arm when the side door into her adjoining room burst open from the other side, and Grant Mercer appeared, his eyes sharp as a blade. He didn't ask a single question. He only saw Tessa holding Owen, saw Eli unsteady in her arm, and he surged forward, took Eli, pressed the baby to his chest, and said only 2 words, "Panic room," before turning and running ahead. Tessa ran behind him with Owen, through her room, out into the East Branch hallway, left turn, 14 steps to the hidden stairwell, down 1 level, and Grant entered the panic room code with one hand, while the other never let go of Eli. The steel door slid open. All 4 of them slipped inside. The red lock button was pressed, the door sealed, and the world outside vanished behind soundproof steel. Inside the panic room, Owen cried hoarse from being jolted. Eli stayed frighteningly quiet in Grant's arms, and Tessa checked him at once. Normal temperature, steady breathing, only startled by being lifted so fast. Grant called Adrian on the satellite phone and spoke in clipped phrases. Second, break-in. Me and Tessa with both boys in the panic room. The mansion was breached from the second floor through a corridor mechanical lock that was opened in advance. Adrian reached the mansion 23 minutes later, and when he walked in, it was already over, but not the way he wanted. The night security team had subdued the 2 intruders on the second floor. Both carried the same Vance pipeline tattoos as the last incident, but one new detail chilled everyone. The corridor's mechanical lock on the first floor hadn't been forced from the outside. It had been opened from the inside with a key, and that key belonged to the set issued to the newest security hire, Wyatt Kane, 29, who joined Caleb's team 6 weeks earlier with a clean file and a recommendation from a reputable suburban security firm. Wyatt Kane wasn't in the mansion when the team counted heads. His spot in the staff room was empty. His personal belongings were gone, and gone with him was something Mara Whitfield didn't discover until the next morning, when she checked the filing cabinet in Adrian's private study. The original hospital documents for Eli and Owen Knox, including birth certificates, newborn medical records, blood type, allergy history, full names, dates of birth, everything someone would need to prove the existence of 2 children to any authority, from a court to the media to Child Protective Services. Adrian stood in the quiet room, staring at the empty cabinet slot where those files had been, and he understood Wyatt Kane wasn't a failed kidnapper. He was an identity thief, and the goal wasn't to take the children. It was to take the story of the children out to the right person who could use it. He was right. At 7 the next morning, Grant placed an iPad on Adrian's desk, the screen already open to an article on Sadie Wynn's site, a notorious Chicago tabloid reporter who made her name digging into the private lives of the underworld. The headline was bold, paired with a blurry photo of the Knox mansion shot from outside the fence, and the large words slammed into view, "Mafia boss neglects newborns," followed by excerpts from medical records claiming 2 infants were living in an unstable and potentially dangerous environment, with commentary from an anonymous source saying the biological father was completely absent in the first 3 months of life, and that the babies had been found lying on a cold floor with no caretaker. Adrian read the entire piece without saying a word, then set the iPad down, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes for 3 seconds, not to calm himself, but to accept that the war had escalated into a new level. a level where guns and fortresses couldn't hold, because the enemy wasn't coming with bullets. They were coming with ink, with public outrage, with the legal system. And Adrian knew the next blow wouldn't come from Nolan Vance, and it wouldn't come from the FBI. It would come from 3 letters that any father feared more than the mouth of a gun: CPS. Sadie Wynn's article spread like wildfire, not because it was brilliant, but because it struck the exact place the public was always starving for: scandal among the powerful and abandoned children, 2 elements that, once combined, became tinder no social media algorithm could resist. Within 24 hours, the piece had been shared thousands of times, comments flooding in from outrage to demands for an investigation, and exactly as Adrian had predicted, the next blow didn't arrive through ink anymore. It arrived with the red stamp of a government agency. On the morning of the 3rd day after the article ran, an official envelope was delivered to the Knox estate through regular mail, no private channel, no intermediary, the kind of envelope that anyone standing outside the gate could recognize as government correspondence, because it carried the logo of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services printed in the upper left corner. Grant brought it into the office. Adrian opened it and read, and every line in the letter arranged itself into a chain he saw through immediately. CPS had received a report from an anonymous source, along with medical records for 2 infant children living at the Knox estate address. The allegations included an unsafe living environment, prolonged paternal absence, children found lying on the floor without supervision, suspected neglect regarding nutrition, and medical care. CPS stated it would conduct an unannounced inspection at the Knox estate on the 12th, 5 days from today, assigned to caseworker Janice Keel, and it required the legal guardian, meaning Adrian, to be present in the home for the duration of the inspection, to answer questions in a direct interview. Adrian set the letter down, and he wasn't angry. He'd moved past anger a long time ago. Now he only analyzed, cold and precise, the way he read a dock route map. He understood the game. Nolan Vance didn't need to kidnap Eli and Owen by hand, because kidnapping was illegal. It cost men, it cost guns, and if it failed, the person at the top got hunted down. But if CPS stepped in, if the file became heavy enough, if a court ordered the children removed from their father because the environment was dangerous, then the babies would be placed into the state foster system. And from there it would take only the right lawyer in the right place, the right foster family, a few signatures from the right hands, and Eli and Owen Knox would disappear from Adrian's reach completely, legally, without Adrian being able to fire a single shot to stop it. Because this time the enemy didn't wear black and break in at midnight. This time the enemy wore a suit, walked in through the front door, and carried court paperwork in a briefcase. That was Vance's cruel genius. He turned the child protection system into a weapon for stealing children. And the sharpest irony of all was that the system would believe it was doing the right thing. Adrian called Grant and Caleb into the office, set the CPS letter down beside the dock map spread across his desk, and that was the moment his 2 worlds collided head-on. Grant reported that the dock meeting Adrian had been setting up all week, the one meant to confront Vance's pipeline directly at the southern docks, the meeting that, if Adrian failed to show, Vance would read as weakness and push deeper into the roots in a single night. That meeting was scheduled for the 12th, the same day CPS would arrive. Adrian stared at the 2 papers on the desk. One, the CPS notice with the inspection date printed in bold. The other, the dock map with the meeting coordinates circled in red. And he understood it wasn't coincidence. Vance knew the day CPS would come because he was the one who'd triggered the process. And he chose that same day to force Adrian down to the docks, because he knew Adrian couldn't be in 2 places at once. If Adrian stayed home to face CPS, the docks would be lost, the routes would be lost, power would be lost, the organization would start to shake, and his capos would begin to question whether the boss was finished. But if Adrian went to the docks, the house would be empty. CPS would write. The father was not present when required, and the legal card would fall straight into Vance's hand. A perfect trap, 2 blades, and Adrian had only 1 throat. Grant spoke. His voice weighted, because he saw the trap too, and he didn't see the way out. Boss, you can't be in 2 places. The docks are life and death for the organization, but CPS is life and death for the kids. If you're not here when Janice Keel arrives, she'll write an unfavorable report, and the next step won't be an unannounced visit. It'll be a court order. Adrian stood by the office window, looking out at the estate grounds under white snow, where inside these walls the nearly 4-month-old babies were sleeping, unaware that a government worker was coming to decide who they belonged to. And outside these walls, a rival boss was waiting at the docks to decide who controlled the streets of Chicago. He had to choose one, and for the first time in Adrian Knox's life, the Mafia boss who controlled half the city's harbor, the man who never let anyone force him into a dilemma because he always created dilemmas for other people. For the first time, he stood between two choices that could each take something he couldn't afford to lose. Then he turned back, looked at Grant, and said, "Call Tessa up here." Tessa walked into the office, and Adrian didn't waste time. He placed the CPS letter in front of her and made her read it from beginning to end. Then he said plainly that on the 12th he couldn't be home, because if he didn't show up at the docks, the organization would lose its root. And when the organization loses roots, it loses money, it loses power, and the wall around this mansion would thin day by day until it couldn't protect anyone anymore, not even Eli and Owen. Then he looked at her and said something Tessa understood Adrian Knox had never said to anyone except Grant Mercer in 12 years of holding power. "I need you to stand in and face CPS for me." Tessa didn't nod right away. She stared at the letter, stared at the name Janice Keel, stared at the words unannounced inspection, and she understood this wasn't an errand. This was a war where the weapons were documents, and the battlefield was the living room. And if she lost, Eli and Owen would be taken by a system no one could fight with a gun. She asked Adrian only one question. "Do you believe I can do it?" Adrian looked at her for 3 seconds, then answered, "You're the only one who can." Over the next 5 days, Tessa prepared as if she were preparing for the biggest battle of her life. She called Dr. Lauren Bishop to the mansion, not for a sick visit, but to request complete copies of Eli and Owen's medical records since birth, including fever reducer prescriptions, vaccination schedules, routine checkup notes, weekly weight and length charts, all signed by Dr. Bishop and stamped with the clinic seal. She organized her handwritten health log into clear sections, labeled by date, highlighting key moments: the night Eli's fever peaked, the night Owen's hoarse crying stretched on, the day she switched formula because Eli had a digestive reaction, the day Owen began gaining weight again after a week of slow growth. She made daily feeding and sleep schedules for both babies on A4 paper, listing exact feeding times, milk amounts, sleep times, sleep durations, room temperature, and body temperature taken every 4 hours. And the stack grew so thick that when she clipped it together, it looked like a thesis, not a childcare journal. She scrubbed the nursery until it shone, arranged diapers, formula, medication, and clothes in an order that would force any CPS worker to admit this was an environment maintained by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And she practiced speaking, not memorizing a script, but practicing how to explain things calmly and clearly, without defensiveness, without aggression, because she understood Janice Keel wasn't an enemy. She was a woman doing her job, and if Tessa confronted her, Janice would write caregiver displays hostile attitude in the report. But if Tessa cooperated with convincing evidence, Janice would have to record the truth. The 12th arrived. Adrian left the mansion at 7 in the morning. Before he went, he stopped in the nursery and looked at the babies sleeping in their cribs, then looked at Tessa standing by the changing table with a neat stack of documents beside her, and he gave a single nod without speaking, because everything that needed saying had already been said. The rest was hers. Janice Keel arrived at 9:15, punctual down to the minute. She was 39, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes sharp behind black-framed glasses, carrying a leather portfolio and a pen, and she walked into the Knox mansion with a face that showed neither awe nor fear at the high ceilings or the crystal chandeliers. She'd been in plenty of wealthy homes, and she knew chandeliers don't raise children. Grant greeted her at the door as the household manager and led her into the living room where Tessa was already waiting, with Eli in her arms and Owen resting in a portable bassinet beside her. Janice looked around the room, took notes, then looked at Tessa and asked in a professional voice with no emotion added, "Who are you in this family?" Tessa answered, "I'm the primary caregiver for Eli and Owen Knox. I live in the mansion and I'm responsible for their feeding, sleep, health, and safety every day." Janice wrote, then asked more, about feeding schedules, and Tessa handed over the chart, about sleep schedules, and Tessa handed over the chart, about medical records, and Tessa handed over the signed copies from Dr. Bishop, about vaccinations, and Tessa produced the immunization record with the clinic stamp, About nursery temperature, and Tessa pointed to the wall thermometer and read the current number, 23 degrees, within pediatric standards. For every question Janice asked, Tessa had an answer with physical proof. Not talk, but paper and ink. And Janice Keel, who'd worked CPS long enough to tell the difference between parents who truly care and parents who perform for an inspector, watched Tessa with an expression where the initial skepticism was slowly giving way to something close to respect. But Janice wasn't a woman easily persuaded by documents alone. She lifted Eli, checked his response, and Eli didn't cry. He looked at her, then turned his head to search for Tessa, and that reaction said more than any chart, because a nearly 4-month-old infant turns toward the person he trusts most, and Eli turned toward Tessa. Janice set Eli down, took more notes, then asked the question Tessa knew was coming, yet still felt heavy when it was spoken out loud. "Where is Mr. Adrian Knox?" Tessa answered evenly. "Mr. Knox had an urgent work matter this morning, but he's prepared to meet with you as soon as he returns." Janice looked at Tessa, then looked around the mansion, wrote something in her notebook that Tessa couldn't see, and she spoke in a level voice, yet each word landed like a judge's gavel on wood. "Miss Hart, I appreciate your preparation, and the babies are clearly well cared for, but I was assigned to assess the living environment and the legal guardian, and that guardian is Mr. Knox, not you. I need to meet him, directly, not through an intermediary, and I need to understand why a father is absent on the very day Child Protective Services arrives to check on his children." She stood, closed her notebook, looked at Tessa one last time, then added, "I also need to understand why a home with military-grade security is being used as a place to raise newborns. I'll be back, and next time I need to see Mr. Knox sitting right here." Janice Keel left the mansion. Her car disappeared beyond the iron gate, and Tessa stood in the living room holding Eli, looking down at the baby's face as he squirmed in her arms, and she knew she had held the line today, but the war wasn't won, because Janice would return, and next time she wouldn't just bring a notebook. She might bring a court order, and Adrian Knox, whether he was fighting at the docks or anywhere else, would have to understand that no route, no multi-million-dollar shipment, mattered more than sitting in that chair and looking Janice Keel in the eye and saying, "I'm the father of these 2 children, and I'm here." Adrian got back to the estate at 3 in the afternoon on the 12th, after the dock meeting where he held the route, but lost one more capo in charge of warehouse logistics, bought off by the other side. And when Grant updated him on the CPS outcome, Adrian's face didn't change, yet his jaw tightened because he knew Janice Keel would come back, and next time she wouldn't be gentle. Before he could even sit down to deal with the pile of maps and numbers on his desk, Mara Whitfield knocked on the office door, and that was unusual, because Mara never knocked on this door unless it was something tied to running the estate that she couldn't decide on her own, and in 14 years of serving the Knox house as head housekeeper, the number of times she'd knocked on the boss's office door could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Mara stepped in, 52 years old, back straight as a ruler, silver hair pinned into a neat bun, her face usually cold as stone, but today something was different. Not fear, because Mara Whitfield didn't know fear, but shame, the kind of feeling Adrian recognized immediately, because he'd tasted it himself not long ago when he stood over his children's cribs. "Mr. Knox, I'm here to tell you something I should have told you 6 weeks ago." Adrian didn't offer her a seat, because Mara never sat in the boss's office. She stood, and she spoke, each sentence as clean as minutes she'd been drafting in her head for nights. 6 weeks earlier, when Caleb Rowe hired additional security staff to cover the night shift, Wyatt Kane submitted an application through official channels, with a recommendation letter and a clean background. Caleb approved it through the proper process. But there was one step she interfered with. Wyatt needed an internal sponsor to be issued a secondary ground floor key and access to the service stairwells connecting to the upper levels, and Mara signed that sponsorship. She signed not because she knew who Wyatt was or who Wyatt belonged to, but because a week before Wyatt applied, she received a call from an old acquaintance, someone who'd helped her when her son had legal trouble 10 years earlier, and that person said there was a good young man who needed work and asked her to help a little with the process. Just one signature, nothing more. Mara signed because she owed that person a favor, and she believed a sponsorship signature for a low-level security hire couldn't do any harm to the Knox estate. She was wrong. She knew she was wrong when Wyatt Kane vanished on the night of the second break-in and took the hospital file for the twins with him, She knew her signature had opened the door for the rat to slip inside, and she'd stayed silent for weeks because she wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid that 14 years of service to the Knox house would be washed away by one stupid signature. Today, when she saw Tessa Hart standing alone in front of CPS defending the two children, while she, the person who'd been in this house the longest, was the one who'd indirectly cleared a path for danger, she couldn't stay silent anymore. Adrian listened, went quiet for 10 seconds, then asked one question. "The acquaintance who called you, what's the name?" Mara gave the name, and Grant, standing in the corner of the room, wrote it down immediately, because he'd traced backward from that name into the Vance line to confirm the link. Adrian didn't shout at Mara, and he didn't throw her out. He only said she would remain on the estate under supervision until everything was over, not as a prisoner, but as a witness, and if she wanted to make up for her mistake, she would cooperate fully with Grant in tracking every contact between her and that old acquaintance. Mara nodded, her eyes red but dry, because Mara Whitfield didn't cry. She carried. She left the office with her back still straight, but her shoulders heavier than when she'd entered. The moment the door closed, Adrian turned to Grant, and he didn't need long to reset the pieces. Wyatt Kane was Vance's eyes planted on the inside, using Mara's signature to get a legal key, using that key to erase cameras, open gates, move records, and disappear at the exact right moment. Now Wyatt was gone and sitting on the other side, but Adrian didn't need to catch Wyatt. He needed to use Wyatt as bait. He ordered Grant to stage a fake shipment at Pier 14, a container full of worthless goods, but packed and moved like a real multi-million-dollar load. The schedule to be leaked through the channel Wyatt had used for internal contact, a channel Caleb had taken control of but intentionally didn't shut down, so the Vance pipeline would believe Knox still hadn't found the transmission line was compromised. The trap was set, and Adrian waited. 2 days later, instead of biting at the docks, Vance answered with a move Adrian didn't anticipate. Evan Pike intercepted an encrypted message from the Vance line, sent to a contact in Chicago, and once Grant decoded it, it held only one line. Drop the child target. Switch to the female target, the housekeeper. Remove her, and the boss collapses. Adrian read that line, and the office seemed to drop a few degrees even though the heat was still running, because he understood Vance had changed tactics. He didn't need to take Eli and Owen anymore because CPS was doing that for him. What he needed now was to eliminate Tessa, the only person standing between the two babies and the system, the person who'd blocked the CPS blow, the person who'd held the babies in the panic room, the person who, if she disappeared, would leave Adrian Knox without his last shield, and both his empire and his family would collapse at the same time. Adrian tightened protection around Tessa the moment he read the decoded line of the message. She wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone inside the Knox mansion. Grant or one of Caleb's trusted security men stayed with her at all times, and the nursery door received an additional mechanical lock, with a key held only by Tessa and Adrian. No one else, not even Grant. But Adrian also knew that staying on defense wasn't a strategy. He needed offense, and the trap at Pier 14 was still set, waiting for the opponent to bite. On the third night after the trap was laid, Adrian left the mansion with Evan Pike and 2 crew members, and went down to the docks to watch the decoy shipment. He believed Vance would send men to take the cargo, and once they touched the container, the net would close. He didn't know the decoy shipment at the docks was only half the board. The other half was unfolding inside the mansion he'd just left behind. At 11:45 that night, Tessa was in the nursery. She'd just finished feeding Owen, and had just settled him back into his crib when she heard a sound that shouldn't have existed at that hour. The faint squeal of the west service door hinge, the kind of sound an ordinary person would miss. But Tessa had lived in this mansion long enough to tell one door from another because at night, when everything fell silent, the house spoke in creaking wood, murmuring pipes, the soft crackle of the fireplace, and the west service door had a distinct squeal Caleb had promised to fix, but hadn't yet. That door was supposed to be locked behind a code known only to Grant and Caleb, but it had just opened, and the one who opened it wasn't Grant, because Grant was in the basement security room, and it wasn't Caleb, because Caleb was on night camera duty. Tessa didn't panic. Her body had been trained by fear through 2 break-ins already, and now fear didn't freeze her. It moved her faster. She lifted Eli first, because Eli's crib was closer to the side door. Then she turned back for Owen, both babies in her arms, and she rushed through the side door into her room, out into the East Branch hallway. left toward the hidden stairwell that led down to the panic room. 14 steps. She counted them the way she'd counted them in her head so many times, but when she reached step 10, she heard feet behind her. Fast, decisive. Not soft shoes like last time, but tactical boots, the kind worn by someone who doesn't need to hide his sound because he hasn't come to sneak. He's come to finish. Tessa ran faster, reached the top of the stairs, took them down, reached the panic room steel door, punched the 6 digits with one hand while the other pinned both babies tight against her chest, scanned her fingerprint. The door slid open, and she laid Eli into the fold-up crib first, then Owen. Then she turned to hit the lock button, but in that same instant, a shadow appeared at the top of the stairwell above, charging down, and Tessa understood in a blink that if she stepped into the panic room and sealed the door, the babies would be safe. But if he managed to wedge himself into the doorway before it closed fully, all 3 of them would die. She looked at Eli and Owen inside the steel room, looked at the dark figure coming down with 5 steps left, and she chose. Tessa pressed the lock from the outside, stepped back from the doorway, and the steel door slid shut in front of her, trapping the babies safely inside and leaving her outside, alone, in the basement corridor with the man charging toward her. He reached her in 3 seconds, tall, dressed head to toe in black, face wrapped, a tactical knife in his hand, not a gun, because guns made noise and he'd been ordered to keep it clean. He looked at the steel door, now sealed, looked at Tessa standing in front of it without a weapon, without armor, without anything but her bare hands and the body of a 28-year-old woman weighing under 60 kilos, and he stepped in. Tessa backed into the steel door, met his eyes, and screamed. Not a scream of fear, but a deliberate one. Loud, ringing, cutting up the basement corridor toward the hidden stairwell, because she knew Caleb was watching cameras and the basement security microphones were still live. He lunged, the knife hand lifting, and in that moment footsteps thundered down from above. Grant came down the stairs with a gun in his hand, shouting, "Stop!" But the man didn't stop. He swung the blade toward Grant, and in the tight space of the basement hallway, 2 bodies slammed together. Grant fired once and hit the man in the thigh. He dropped, but the knife arm still lashed, slicing Grant's arm, blood spraying the wall, and Tessa pressed herself flat to the steel door, not daring to move, because one wrong step could put her into the path of the blade. Then came a second set of footsteps from the main stairs, heavy and fast, and Adrian Knox appeared at the end of the basement hall, his coat dusted with dock grit, his eyes scanning the scene in less than a second, seeing Grant pinning the man to the floor, seeing blood on Grant's arm, seeing Tessa braced against the panic room door, white-faced but upright, and he closed the distance, drew his gun, aimed it at the man's head, and said, "Drop the knife." The man dropped it, not from fear, but because his thigh was bleeding out, and he didn't have the strength to hold it anymore. Adrian yanked the face covering down. The man was unfamiliar. About 32, a tattoo on his neck, not Vance's broken circle, a different mark, the sign of a professional dirty work team, the kind the underworld called a cleaner. Adrian crouched, grabbed the man by the collar, and asked, "Who hired you?" The man smiled, blood seeping through his teeth, and he rasped in a voice roughened by blood loss, "You think Holt did it? Holt's just a tentacle. You haven't seen the head." Then he coughed, and more blood poured out. Grant's bullet hadn't only hit his thigh, it had torn an artery, and he was losing blood faster than anyone could stop. Adrian watched him die on the basement floor of his own mansion, watched the red spread across cold concrete. Then he stood and looked at Tessa. She was still there, her back against the steel door, face pale, hands shaking, but her eyes stayed on him, and in those eyes there were no tears, no accusation, only a silent question he could read as clearly as printed words. "Are the babies safe?" Adrian opened the panic room. The babies lay inside the crib, Owen crying hoarse, Eli silent but breathing evenly, and Adrian understood what Tessa had done. She had locked his sons behind steel and stood outside, using her own body as the barrier to make sure no one could touch them, even if it cost her life. He looked at her and he wanted to say something, but Adrian Knox's language didn't have a word big enough for that moment, so he only reached out, took her arm gently, pulled her into the panic room, closed the door, and for the first time all 5 of them, Adrian, Tessa, Grant bleeding, and the 2 babies, were together inside the steel room under the ground, safe, and surrounded by the question the dying man had left behind. If Holt was only a tentacle, then who was the head? And Adrian Knox realized for the first time that he wasn't fighting Nolan Vance alone. Someone bigger, deeper, was behind it all. Someone he hadn't seen, but who had already seen everything he had. Adrian didn't wait for the enemy's next strike. He'd waited long enough. 3 break-ins, 1 killer dead on his own floor, CPS at his door, a tabloid printing his name, and now someone hidden behind Holt Rigsby and Nolan Vance was pulling the strings like a puppet show, and Adrian Knox wasn't anyone's puppet. 2 days after the night the assassin got into the house, when the wound on Grant's arm had just been stitched by Dr. Bishop with 12 stitches, and Tessa was still sleeping beside the twins' cribs in the panic room because she refused to go back to the second-floor nursery until security had swept every inch again. Adrian convened a final meeting in his office. Grant, Caleb, Evan Pike, and the 2 remaining capos he trusted most sat around the table. The dock map spread out, and Adrian laid out a plan he called the fishing trap. Not for small fish anymore, this time for a shark. The fake shipment at Pier 14 was still sitting there. The other side hadn't bitten because they were busy dealing with the failed hit on Tessa. But Adrian knew Vance couldn't ignore a multi-million-dollar haul forever, because the nature of greed was that it couldn't resist fat bait, and Adrian only needed to make the bait fatter. He ordered Evan to leak through Wyatt Kane's old channel that the cargo at Pier 14 would be moved on Saturday night, and with that same load, Adrian himself would go down to the docks to supervise because the boss didn't trust anyone anymore after the inside leak. Information designed to make Vance believe this was a double chance, steal the shipment, and take Adrian out at the harbor, and a man like Vance wouldn't be able to resist it. Saturday night, the Calumet docks sank into fog rising off Lake Michigan, the thick kind that ate visibility down to less than 20 meters, and Adrian stood in the container yard at Pier 14 like a living target. Black coat on. Evan, 5 steps away. But what Vance couldn't see in the fog was that 14 Knox men had been positioned since afternoon, lying still between containers, on top of the warehouse roof, along the eastern side gate fence line, and beneath 2 trucks already parked at the edge of the pier, while Caleb coordinated from a comms vehicle parked outside a 300-meter radius with thermal cameras and encrypted radios. At 11:20, Vance's team appeared. Not 2 or 3 men like before, but 8, split into 2 groups. One group of 4, advancing from the main gate of Pier 14, the other circling through Pier 13 to approach from the riverside, and moving with the main gate group was a face Grant recognized immediately on the thermal feed. Nolan Vance himself had come down, 45 years old, tall, haircut close, black leather jacket, the walk of a man who believed tonight would end the game. Vance advanced toward Container 14. His people fanned out, and when he was less than 15 meters from Adrian hit the container floodlights, white light tearing the fog apart, and Vance and his team saw what they hadn't expected. The container stood wide open, empty, no cargo, nothing at all except 2 high-powered speakers and a board with Adrian's handwritten words taped to it, "Welcome to my house." Then Caleb gave the order over the radio, and 14 Knox men revealed themselves at once from every direction. Tactical flashlights snapping on, the ring closing, 8 Vance men surrounded by nearly double the numbers, and pinned between the containers and the water behind them. No clean way out. Blood hit the ground in less than 90 seconds. Not a slaughter, but a controlled suppression. Knox men fired warning shots first. 2 of Vance's men drew and fired back and were dropped immediately. 4 more threw down their weapons and fell to their knees when they saw their men go down, and Nolan Vance stood in the middle of the circle, his face not afraid but not smiling either, looking at Adrian with the eyes of someone who knew he'd been lured and still refused to concede. Grant lunged in to tie Vance up. But at that exact moment, one man from the Riverside group, someone Knox had thought was already kneeling, suddenly pulled a knife from the tube of his boot and rushed Adrian, the blade slicing through Adrian's coat and carving a long line across Adrian's left arm before Evan Pike dropped the attacker with a single shot to the shoulder. Adrian looked down at his arm, blood seeping through black fabric, the cut not deep but long enough to hurt, and long enough to remind him that even if he was the boss, the docks didn't care who you were once the knife was out. But Adrian didn't stop. He stepped through a pool of blood on the concrete, walked up to Vance, who was forced down on his knees under Grant's weight, and looked at the enemy he'd been hunting for weeks. Vance lifted his head to meet his gaze, and in Vance's eyes, Adrian didn't see surrender. He saw something else, a strange satisfaction, as if being caught was part of the plan, or as if Vance knew that even if Adrian won tonight, the game still wasn't over. Adrian ordered Caleb to move Vance and the 3 survivors to a backup warehouse outside the city for questioning. Ordered the team to clean the pier, erase traces, remove the 2 bodies for disposal, and get it all done before dawn. Adrian was turning back toward the vehicle when Evan Pike ran up, his face paler than usual, and he handed Adrian binoculars, pointing toward the highway about 400 meters from the pier. Adrian raised the binoculars and saw them. 2 black sedans with no plates parked at the edge of the access road into the industrial zone, the kind of cars anyone who'd lived in Chicago long enough would recognize as federal. And leaning back against one of the doors stood a man in a long coat, holding a cup of coffee, watching the pier through binoculars of his own. And even though Adrian couldn't make out the face at that distance, he knew exactly who it was. Agent Howard Greer, FBI, Rico, the man who'd been building a file for months, and was now standing there watching Adrian Knox fire shots, bind men, and clear bodies at a Chicago dock, like he was watching a play he'd bought tickets for a long time ago, only waiting for the final act so he could step onto the stage. Adrian lowered the binoculars, looked at the blood running down his arm, looked at the dock being scrubbed clean behind him, looked at the 2 black sedans sitting still ahead, and he understood that tonight he'd beaten Vance, but the FBI had seen everything, and the vice hadn't loosened. It had just tightened one more notch. Nolan Vance talked after 14 hours in a warehouse outside the suburbs. Not because Grant used violence, but because Grant used something more frightening: the truth. He laid the proof in front of Vance that the 2 killers Vance had sent into the Knox mansion were both dead, that the 8 men Vance had brought down to the docks last night were either dead or in custody, that Wyatt Kane had been traced by Caleb and was hiding in a motel on the western edge of the suburbs, where Evan Pike's team would be within a few hours, and that Vance was sitting here now with no soldiers left, no road home, and only one man deciding whether he walked out of this warehouse on his own 2 legs or inside a body bag: Adrian Knox. Vance looked at the evidence, looked at Grant, and then he spoke, not to beg, but to bargain, because Nolan Vance was a trader by nature, and he traded down to his last breath. He gave up the financial route, not his route, but the larger route, the one he was only a branch of. Money flowing from 3 sources outside Chicago, through an intermediary bank in Milwaukee, then pouring into a real estate investment fund that on paper belonged to a completely legitimate company, but in reality was the mask of a laundering network serving multiple organizations, including the pipeline Holt Rigsby had used to sell Knox information. And the man at the top of that fund, the man who designed the pincer, using Vance to strike from the street and a RICO file to strike from federal court, wasn't Vance. Vance was only ambitious muscle. The architect was a name Adrian had heard in passing in the underworld, but he'd never put it on his own balance sheet because the man hid too well behind the clean shell of a businessman. Grant recorded everything: names, account numbers, transfer routes, lists of shell companies, and when he set the file on Adrian's desk, his face carried an expression Tessa would have called the face of a man who'd just found a treasure map, but the treasure sat in the middle of a minefield. Because now Adrian stood in front of a choice with no clean answer. Option 1. Handle Vance and the mastermind by street law. Use what Vance confessed to track the rival pipeline to its end and erase it. That path preserved reputation on the streets, preserved discipline inside the organization. But the FBI had been standing at the edge of the docks watching him open fire last night. The RICO file was thickening by the day, and if Adrian kept operating by street law, Agent Greer would have enough to turn him from a boss into a federal prisoner, and once Adrian sat behind bars, CPS would take Eli and Owen legally, and no one could stop it. Option 2. Hand Vance and the entire financial route to the FBI. Let Greer destroy the rival network with law instead of bullets, and in return, Adrian demanded that the FBI drop the RICO case targeting the Knox organization, or at least back off long enough for him to restructure. That cut the enemy, but it also meant Adrian Knox had to cooperate with the federal government, and in his world that was the same as suicide, because if the underworld learned he'd spoken to the FBI, he'd lose everything: routes, allies, credibility, and his life. 2 choices, 2 knives, and Adrian had only one hand to hold them. He sat in his office all night, staring at the docks map, staring at Vance's file, staring at the CPS letter still lying at the corner of his desk. And he thought of Eli's frown in sleep, so like his mother, thought of Owen's hoarse crying in the middle of the night, thought of Tessa standing outside the panic room door, putting her body between steel and a blade, and he understood that every choice he'd ever made could be wrong except one: keeping his children safe. The next morning, Adrian did something no one in the Knox organization expected. He had Grant drive him to a coffee shop in the northern suburbs of Chicago, where he sat across from Agent Howard Greer, 47, salt and pepper hair, eyes cold and patient like a fisherman who'd waited months for his catch and now watched the fish swim to him. But Adrian didn't come to surrender. He put a thick envelope on the table, containing copies of the rival network's financial route, the mastermind's name, account numbers, shell companies, enough for the FBI to break something far larger than the Knox organization, and he spoke in a voice that made Greer lean in to hear, because Adrian never spoke loudly when he negotiated. "You want a big fish? I'll give you a big fish. In return, Rico stops here. You don't touch my organization for 18 months, and you never put my son's names into any file, ever." Greer looked at the envelope, looked at Adrian, and he didn't agree right away because the FBI doesn't bargain fast, but he didn't refuse either because the name inside that envelope was bigger than Adrian Knox, and in the federal world, a bigger fish always tastes better than a smaller one. Greer said he needed time to verify. Adrian said he had 48 hours. Then Adrian stood, left the envelope on the table, and walked out of the coffee shop without a handshake, because Adrian Knox didn't shake hands with the FBI. He used them the way he used a blade, cut what needed cutting, then put it away. And if the blade turned and cut him, he'd deal with that blade by other means. On the drive back to the mansion, Adrian called Grant on the private line and gave an order that made Grant ask twice just to make sure he'd heard correctly. "Find Holt Rigsby. Bring him back to the mansion. Alive." Grant went silent for 3 seconds, then asked, "Boss wants him brought in for questioning or for execution?" Adrian looked out the car window. The snow was melting on Chicago sidewalks, water running along the gutter like veins showing through as the ice was stripped away, and he said, "To end it." Grant found Holt Rigsby after 26 hours. He hadn't run far. He was in a short-term rental apartment in Logan Square, less than 30 minutes from the Knox estate by car, as if he knew Adrian would call sooner or later, and he wanted to stay close enough that he wouldn't have to travel when that day came. When Evan Pike's crew brought him back to the estate at 9 o'clock that night, Holt wasn't bound. He wasn't blindfolded. He sat in the back seat like a guest arriving late to a party. The gray suit he'd worn the last time he walked into Adrian's office was still a gray suit. The ring on his pinky was still there. The smile on his mouth was still there too, only thinner now, like the smile of a man grinning on a rope. Adrian waited for him in the office. The desk lamp threw a muddy gold light across the familiar walnut surface. Grant stood in the corner. Caleb held the door from outside. When Holt stepped in, everything looked exactly like the last time he'd been here. The same room, the same light, the same positions, with only one difference. Last time, he'd walked out on his own 2 feet after saying, "The rat eyes inside your house." This time, he wasn't going to have that choice. Adrian didn't offer Holt a chair. He didn't pour a drink. There was no long exchange like something from a movie, because Adrian Knox didn't enjoy the sound of his own voice. He enjoyed results. He placed 3 things on the desk. Nolan Vance's statement confirming Holt was the first to sell information about Adrian's weak point to the rival pipeline. A call record Grant had pulled showing Holt contacting the handler's intermediary right after the day he was kicked out of the estate, and the photo of Tessa holding the twins, with the words, "Nice family" written under it, a photo Caleb had now traced back and confirmed was taken on Holt's phone on the very night he slipped into the nursery before Tessa stopped him. 3 pieces of proof, 3 nails driven into the coffin Holt was standing in. Holt looked down at the desk, at the 3 items, then lifted his eyes to Adrian, and this time he didn't smile, yet he didn't look afraid either. He looked tired, the tiredness of someone who'd run enough circles to know the road was finished. "You know why I did it, Knox?" Holt said, and his voice no longer carried the mocking laugh from last time. "Because you changed. You used to be steel, no weak points, no attachments, and I respected that. Then the 2 kids were born. Then the little housekeeper showed up. You started having something to lose. A man with something to lose is easy to hit, and I chose to stand with the ones swinging." Adrian listened and didn't answer, because Holt's words weren't wrong, and they didn't change anything. Adrian stood, walked around the desk, stopped in front of Holt at less than an arm's length, and spoke in a voice as flat as the wood beneath his hand. Not angry, not hateful, not shaking, only truth turned into sound. You sold information about my children. You took a picture of my children. You cleared the path for someone to put drugs in my baby's bottle, for someone to break into my house, for someone to chase the person caring for my children with a knife in my basement. You're right. I've got something to lose. Because of you, I almost lost it. Holt looked at Adrian, and for the first time there was something in Holt Rigsby's eyes that resembled admission, not regret. Holt didn't know regret, but the admission that he'd gambled and he'd lost. Adrian tipped his chin toward Grant. Grant stepped forward. What happened next in the office didn't take long. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical, because the Knox rule didn't need an audience. It only needed to be enforced. Tessa wasn't in the office, but she was in the nursery one floor above, and she heard it. Not a gunshot, because Adrian didn't use a gun inside the house where his children slept. But the silence, the thick, heavy silence that rose from downstairs after the last footsteps stopped, and she understood what had happened, even without seeing it. She sat in the rocking chair beside Owen's crib, her hand still patting his back in a steady rhythm, and she looked out the window where night covered the estate grounds, and she thought about Adrian Knox, the man who'd awkwardly learned how to hold his baby not long ago, the man who'd asked her how to bring down a fever in a shy voice, the man who'd sat on the nursery floor holding Eli because there wasn't a second chair, and also the man who had just dealt with a life downstairs with a calm she would never fully understand. Yet Tessa understood something else too. The safety she and the two babies had wasn't free. It was bought with what Adrian paid every night, with the darkness he swallowed so there'd be room left for light to reach his children. She didn't judge him. She wasn't entitled to judge a father using everything he had to keep his children alive. She also didn't pretend she didn't know. The Knox estate went quiet after that night, but this silence was different. It wasn't the haunted hush of a house waiting for the next blow. It was the quiet of a house that had closed one chapter, slowing its breathing before it opened the next. 2 weeks after the night, Holt Rigsby walked into the Knox mansion for the last time. Everything changed. Not loudly, but down to the roots, the way melting snow sinks into the ground after a long winter. Agent Howard Greer kept his word. 48 hours after the meeting at the suburban coffee shop, the FBI finished verifying the financial route Adrian had provided and discovered it was far larger than they'd believed. A laundering pipeline through a Milwaukee real estate investment fund that connected not only to Vance, but to 3 other organizations across the Midwest. And the mastermind's name Vance had given became the federal government's top target, replacing the RICO file aimed at Knox. Greer didn't sign anything promising Adrian, because the FBI doesn't sign promises to criminals on paper, but he pulled the surveillance team off the Calumet docks, froze the RICO case, and shifted resources to the new investigation. And in the underworld of law, actions speak louder than signatures. Adrian didn't fool himself into thinking the FBI would forget him forever. Greer was the patient type, and the RICO file wasn't erased. It was only frozen. But 18 months was long enough to do what needed doing. He began restructuring the Knox organization in the first week, not expanding, but shrinking, cutting the high-risk dock routes, shutting down 2 fringe piers to reduce attack surface, moving cash flow into a new system. Grant designed with 3 layers of protection instead of 1, replacing every security hire Caleb hadn't personally recruited and vetted, and most of all, separating the organization's operations completely from the mansion. No Mafia meetings inside the home where his children slept anymore. The office returning to what it should have been all along. The office of a father, not the command center of a boss. The Vance pipeline collapsed after the FBI raided the Milwaukee Investment Fund. Nolan Vance was handed over to the federal government through a channel no one could trace back to Adrian. The mastermind was arrested at his suburban Chicago home, with evidence strong enough to put him in federal prison for decades. And Wyatt Kane was found at the Western Motel exactly as Caleb predicted. The survivor from the first break-in, who had been held for questioning, was handled alongside Wyatt through Grant's private channel, and those names vanished from every list as if they had never existed. Sadie Wynn received a call from Adrian's attorney, informing her that her article was based on stolen records, and that her anonymous source was a member of a criminal organization now being prosecuted by the FBI. The story was taken down within 24 hours, and Sadie didn't write another line about the Knox house. CPS returned for a second visit exactly 3 weeks after the first. Janice Keel walked into the mansion, and this time Adrian Knox sat in the very chair in the living room that Tessa had held for him, Eli in his arms, Owen in a portable bassinet beside him, showing the healthy growth of nearly 4-month-old infants. When Janice asked him about his role in the family, He answered not with a boss's commanding voice, but with the voice of a father who knew exactly how many milliliters his sons drank per feeding, how many hours they slept each night, when the last fever happened, and what medication was used. Because he had read Tessa's logbook from the first page to the last, and now he was writing the new pages himself. Janice watched him, watched Tessa, watched two babies who were healthy and responding normally, and she wrote in her report that the living environment was stable. The primary caregiver was capable and devoted. The legal guardian was present and showed appropriate attachment to the children. And the CPS case was closed with no court order issued. 1 week after the CPS report, Adrian called Tessa into his office, but this time the desk held no USB, no threatening photo, no docs map, only a legal packet prepared by a family attorney. He slid it toward her and told her it was an official contract, not a housekeeper's contract, but a caregiver and auxiliary guardianship agreement, giving Tessa Hart legal standing in caring for Eli and Owen Knox, the right to make medical decisions when Adrian wasn't present, the right to represent the children before schools, hospitals, and government agencies, and protection by law, instead of only by locks and a panic room. Tessa read every page. Her hands didn't shake the way they had the first time she'd stepped into this office, and when she signed on the final page, it wasn't just ink on paper. It was an acknowledgement that she was no longer an outsider in this home. She belonged here, not because Adrian Knox allowed it, but because Eli and Owen needed her, and she chose to stay for them. That night, snow fell again over Chicago, lighter than last season, not the kind of storm that rips roofs, but the kind that lays down soft, like someone tucking a blanket over the city. In the nursery of the Knox mansion, the fireplace burned steady, the glow throwing warm, moving shadows across the ceiling. Eli asleep in his crib, temperature 36.8, normal, Owen beside him, the baby's hand curled in his dream as if he were holding tight to something no one else could see. Tessa sat in the rocking chair with the logbook open on her lap. Today's entry finished, and she glanced toward the door where Adrian stood, not standing outside looking in the way he had in the first weeks when he'd still been a stranger father inside his own home, but standing inside, his back against the wall beside Owen's crib, eyes half closed, breathing even, and for the first time, Adrian Knox didn't need a reason to be in the nursery. He was here because he wanted to be, because this was where his son slept, because this was the only place in this vast mansion where he didn't feel like a boss, not a kingpin, not a man who just cut a deal with the FBI, or a man who just ended a life, but simply a man standing beside his children's crib, listening to them breathe. And this is where our story pauses. But before we stop, there's something I want to say to you. This story isn't only about the Mafia, or the streets, or the docks. It's about something very simple, we sometimes forget in a busy life: presence. Adrian Knox had money, power, and empire, but he almost lost his 2 sons not because the enemy was too strong, but because he wasn't there. And Tessa Hart had nothing. No family, no money, no power. But she kept 2 babies safe because she chose to stay when everything around her screamed for her to run. The lesson is that sometimes the most precious thing you can give the people you love isn't money. And it isn't perfect protection. It's showing up. It's being there. It's being truly present in their lives with your whole heart, not only your responsibility. So I want to ask you, how did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that touched your heart? And in real life, have you ever had to choose between career and family? Between logic and the instinct to protect the people you love? Please share with us in the comments below. I read every comment, and I want to hear your story from deep in your heart. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video with the people you love, so every day we can listen together to more stories that are moving and memorable. We wish all of you watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.